Some moments in human history leave behind shadows that facts alone cannot explain. From eerie discoveries to unresolved events that challenge our understanding, certain mysteries continue to echo through time. Hidden records, puzzling evidence, and haunting accounts reveal stories that remain beyond ordinary answers. High above the rugged landscapes of western Britain, where ancient stone walls rise from mist-covered hills and winds move through the remains of forgotten settlements, the legend of King Arthur continues to cast a long shadow. His name is carved into the imagination of generations, not as a simple figure from the past, but as a symbol of courage, justice, and a kingdom that may have existed somewhere between history and myth. The earliest traces of Arthur do not come from the famous tales of a magical sword, a round table, or a royal court filled with legendary knights. Those elements emerged centuries later through medieval writers who transformed a possible historical figure into one of the most enduring heroes in literature. The first references to Arthur appear in early Welsh writings, where he is described not as a king sitting upon a grand throne, but as a powerful warrior who defended Britain during a turbulent age. This period, often called the early medieval era, followed the withdrawal of Roman forces from Britain around the 5th century. As Roman influence faded, communities faced invasions, shifting alliances, and struggles for control. Some historians believe that behind the Arthurian legend may have been a real military leader who united groups of Britons against invading forces, perhaps during conflicts involving the Saxons. Yet, the search for the true Arthur remains complicated. No confirmed historical record identifies a ruler named Arthur, who commanded a kingdom resembling the one described in later stories. Archaeological discoveries have revealed important settlements and powerful leaders from the era, but none provide undeniable evidence of the legendary king. One possible connection has been suggested with figures such as Roman British commanders who lived during the collapse of Roman authority. Some researchers have proposed that Arthur may have been inspired by a warrior from this unstable period, someone whose victories were later expanded through storytelling. Others have examined locations linked to the legend, including Tintagel Castle, where medieval tradition associated Arthur's birth with a dramatic coastal fortress. Archaeological findings show that the site was once a significant place of power, but they do not confirm the existence of Arthur himself. Over time, the story grew. Writers added elements that shaped the Arthur known today: the sword Excalibur, the wisdom of Merlin, the search for the Holy Grail, and the idealized vision of Camelot. These additions reveal as much about the societies that preserved the legend as they do about the person who may have inspired it. Some theories place Arthur among forgotten rulers, military commanders, or regional leaders whose names disappeared while their deeds survived through oral tradition. Others suggest that Arthur was never a single individual, but a collection of memories combined into one extraordinary figure. Neither possibility can be proven completely. Between the evidence left behind in ancient landscapes and the stories carried through countless generations, King Arthur remains suspended between reality and legend. Was he a forgotten warrior whose achievements became exaggerated over time, or a symbol created from the hopes and fears of a changing world? The answer may still be waiting somewhere within the fragments of the past. Far beyond the borders of the Roman world, beneath the wide skies of the Eurasian steppe, a powerful ruler prepared for a celebration that would become his final night. The exact location of the event has never been confirmed, but the memory of that evening has survived for more than 15 centuries. It was the wedding night of Attila the Hun, a man whose name once carried fear across continents, and whose sudden death left behind a question that historians still struggle to answer. During the 5th century, Attila commanded the Hunnic Empire at the height of its influence. His armies challenged both the Eastern and Western Roman empires, forcing emperors to negotiate with a ruler who had built his power through military skill, political strategy, and an ability to unite diverse groups under his authority. To his enemies, he was a devastating force. To his followers, he was a leader capable of creating one of the most formidable powers of his age. Yet, in the year AD 453, after years of campaigns and diplomatic struggles, Attila died unexpectedly. Ancient sources tell us that he had married a young woman named Ildiko and celebrated the occasion with a great feast. The following morning, he was discovered lifeless beside his new bride. The account comes mainly from the writings of the Roman historian Priscus, whose descriptions of the Hunnic court provide some of the most valuable information about Attila's world. According to later reports, there were no obvious signs of a battle or attack. Instead, the explanation offered was surprisingly ordinary. Attila may have suffered a severe nosebleed while sleeping, possibly combined with heavy drinking during the celebration, causing him to choke on his own blood. For centuries, this remained the most accepted explanation. But the circumstances surrounding his death have encouraged historians and researchers to examine other possibilities. Could a man who survived countless battles and political conflicts have truly died from an accidental medical event on such a significant night? Some theories have suggested that Attila may have been assassinated. His enemies were numerous, and his growing influence had created fear among powerful rivals. The Roman Empire, neighboring kingdoms, and even internal factions within his own empire all had reasons to view his death as an opportunity. However, there is no direct evidence proving that a conspiracy took place. Other interpretations focus on the possibility of a health-related cause. Chronic stress, physical exhaustion, injuries from years of warfare, or underlying conditions could have contributed to his sudden collapse. In an age without modern medicine, even a seemingly minor illness could become fatal within hours. There are also questions surrounding the events after his death. Historical accounts describe his followers carrying out secret burial traditions, reportedly placing him in a hidden grave along with valuable treasures. The location of his burial site has never been discovered, adding another layer of uncertainty to his story. The mystery of Attila's final night remains a meeting point between documented history and unanswered questions. The evidence suggests several possible explanations, yet none can completely reveal what happened inside that ancient hall when one of history's most powerful rulers took his last breath. Was his death simply a tragic accident, the result of a hidden illness, or something more carefully concealed by those who stood to gain from his disappearance? The truth may still lie buried somewhere beneath the landscapes that once witnessed the rise and fall of the Hunnic Empire. As the echoes of Attila the Hun's final years continue to reveal unanswered questions, another moment in his life remains equally difficult to explain. In the summer of AD 452, the armies of the Huns stood deep inside the heart of the Roman world. Fields across northern Italy had been crossed by thousands of warriors, and the road ahead appeared open toward some of the greatest cities of the empire. Yet, at the height of his campaign, Attila made a decision that surprised both his enemies and later historians. He turned away. Across the landscapes of northern Italy, from the abandoned roads of Roman provinces to the fortified walls of ancient cities, the memory of that invasion remains. Attila had entered Italy with a reputation built on unstoppable conquest. Only a year earlier, he had challenged the Western Roman Empire, and now his forces had crossed the Alps, capturing important settlements and spreading fear throughout the region. One of the most significant events of the campaign was the fall of Aquileia, a wealthy and strategically important city. According to later accounts, the siege lasted for a long period, and its destruction became a symbol of the devastation brought by the Hunnic advance. After this victory, the path toward the Italian heartland seemed increasingly vulnerable. Yet something changed. Rather than continuing south toward Rome and completing what could have been one of the most dramatic victories of his career, Attila withdrew his army. The decision has remained one of the great mysteries surrounding his rule. Why would a leader who had defeated powerful opponents suddenly abandon a campaign while his enemies appeared weakened? The traditional explanation points to practical concerns. The Hunnic army was operating far from its homeland, and Italy in AD 452 was suffering from disease, famine, and instability. Ancient sources suggest that sickness spread among Attila's troops, making a prolonged campaign increasingly dangerous. Maintaining a large army in unfamiliar territory required constant supplies, and the conditions may have made further expansion too costly. Another factor may have been the arrival of a Roman diplomatic mission led by Pope Leo I. According to tradition, the meeting between Attila and the Roman representatives influenced his decision to retreat. Later stories portrayed the encounter as a mysterious moment in which the power of faith convinced the conqueror to spare Rome. Historians, however, often view the event through a more practical lens, suggesting that negotiations, political calculations, and military realities likely played a greater role. Some theories propose that Attila had other concerns beyond Italy itself. His empire depended on alliances, tribute, and control over distant territories. A long campaign in Italy may have weakened his position elsewhere, creating risks within his own realm. Others have suggested that the withdrawal was part of a larger strategy rather than a defeat, allowing Attila to preserve his forces for future ambitions. There are also more speculative interpretations. Some have wondered whether Attila received warnings, political offers, or information that remains unknown today. Could there have been secret agreements behind the scenes? Did unseen pressures from within his own empire influence his choice? The surviving records provide clues, but they leave many details hidden. What is clear is that Attila's retreat was not simply the end of a failed invasion. It was a decision made by one of history's most complex rulers, balancing military strength, political reality, and the uncertain challenges of a rapidly changing world. The armies of the Huns disappeared from Italy, but the reason behind their sudden departure remains a question suspended between evidence and speculation. Was Attila forced away by circumstances beyond his control, or did he leave with knowledge that history never recorded? Somewhere within the lost conversations, forgotten documents, and silent ruins of the 5th century, the true reason may still be waiting. The story of Attila the Hun does not end with his final breath. In the years that followed his death, the vast power he had created across the Eurasian plains began to fracture with astonishing speed. The same empire that had once forced Roman emperors to negotiate, demanded tribute from powerful kingdoms, and sent fear across Europe seemed to disappear almost as quickly as it had risen. Across the grasslands north of the Black Sea, and the open territories once controlled by the Huns, traces of that vanished empire remain scattered among ancient burial sites, weapons, and forgotten settlements. These fragments offer glimpses of a world that once moved with the rhythm of mounted armies and powerful alliances. But they also raise a deeper mystery. How could an empire built by one of history's most feared conquerors collapse so completely after his death? When Attila died in AD 453, the Hunnic Empire faced a challenge that many steppe empires struggled with throughout history: succession. Attila had ruled through personal authority, military reputation, and a network of relationships with different tribes and regional leaders. His strength was not only in his armies, but in his ability to keep competing groups united under a single banner. After his death, that unity began to weaken. Attila left behind several sons, including Elac, Dengizic, and Ernak, who inherited the responsibility of maintaining control over the empire. However, unlike their father, they did not possess the same influence over the many groups that had followed him. The Hunnic Empire was not a centralized state with fixed borders and a permanent government structure. It was a collection of tribes and allies held together by loyalty, fear, and the promise of victory. Without Attila's leadership, those connections became fragile. One of the first major signs of collapse came at the Battle of Nidau in AD 454. According to historical accounts, a coalition of subject peoples, including the Germanic Gepids under King Ardaric, challenged Hunnic dominance. The result was a devastating defeat for Attila's successors. The battle marked a turning point, as many groups that had once served the Huns regained their independence. But was the fall of the Hunnic Empire caused by a single battle, or had deeper problems already begun to appear? Some historians believe the empire's collapse was the result of internal instability. Attila's power depended heavily on his personal ability to control rival groups. Once he was gone, old tensions may have returned. Former allies may have questioned why they should continue paying tribute or following a weakened royal family. Others point toward economic pressures. A nomadic empire built around warfare required constant movement, expansion, and access to resources. Military victories brought wealth, prisoners, and tribute. But without new campaigns and successful leadership, maintaining such a system became increasingly difficult. The same structure that allowed the Huns to expand rapidly may have also made them vulnerable when expansion slowed. Environmental factors have also been considered. The Eurasian steppe was a challenging environment where changes in climate, pasture conditions, and access to resources could influence the movement and survival of large populations. Some researchers have explored whether shifts in the environment contributed to political instability among steppe societies. However, the exact role these factors played in the Hunnic collapse remains uncertain. There is also the question of identity. Unlike kingdoms with permanent cities, monuments, and written traditions, the Huns left behind fewer records created by themselves. Much of what is known comes from Roman and other outside observers, who often viewed them through the lens of conflict. This creates a historical shadow where parts of their story remain difficult to reconstruct. After the collapse, the Huns did not simply disappear overnight. Some groups continued to exist, merging with neighboring peoples or becoming part of new political communities. The name Hun gradually faded from historical records, but the movements, alliances, and cultural exchanges created during their empire continued to influence the regions they once dominated. Some theories suggest that the rapid decline of the Hunnic Empire was not unusual. Throughout history, many powerful states have depended on a single, extraordinary ruler. When that figure disappears, hidden weaknesses can suddenly become visible. In this view, Attila's death did not destroy the empire by itself. It revealed how much the entire system depended on one man. Yet, there are still unanswered questions. Did rival leaders secretly prepare for rebellion before Attila's death? Were there forgotten conflicts within his own family that accelerated the collapse? Could environmental changes or economic struggles have played a greater role than historians currently understand? The ruins and records left behind tell the story of an empire that rose with remarkable speed and vanished almost as quickly. But between the surviving accounts and the silence of the lost centuries lies a mystery that continues to challenge historians. The Hunnic Empire may have fallen, but the forces that shaped its final days remain only partially revealed, leaving us to wonder what hidden events truly brought an unstoppable power to its end. As the remnants of the Hunnic Empire faded into the changing landscape of the 5th century, the Roman world faced another crisis unfolding within its own walls. In the heart of ancient Rome, among marble halls, military camps, and the fading symbols of imperial authority, a powerful emperor met a violent end. The death of Valentinian III would not only remove a ruler from the throne, it would expose the fragile alliances, hidden rivalries, and political uncertainty consuming the Western Roman Empire. On a spring day in AD 455, Valentinian III was attacked while visiting the Campus Martius, a large public area in Rome traditionally connected with military training and political gatherings. According to ancient accounts, the emperor was struck down by two soldiers who had once served under him. His death was sudden, public, and shocking, but behind the blades of his assassins was a deeper question that historians have debated for centuries. Who truly wanted Valentinian dead? To understand the mystery, it is necessary to look back at the troubled years of his reign. Valentinian III became emperor as a child in AD 425, following a period of instability within the Western Roman Empire. Because he was too young to rule independently, much of the real power was held by influential figures around him, especially his mother, Galla Placidia, and later powerful military commanders. The empire he inherited was already under pressure from economic difficulties, internal conflicts, and increasing threats along its borders. For much of his reign, the most influential figure in Western Roman politics was Flavius Aetius. A skilled commander and politician, Aetius became the empire's leading military authority. He played a major role in defending Roman territory, including the famous confrontation with Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in AD 451. Yet, the relationship between Valentinian and Aetius was complicated. Although the emperor depended on his general's abilities, Aetius's immense influence created tension. To some observers, the general appeared almost like a ruler behind the throne. To others, he was the only person capable of holding together an empire facing collapse. That fragile balance ended in AD 454. According to historical sources, Valentinian III personally attacked and killed Aetius during a meeting in the imperial palace. The reasons behind this decision remain debated. Some accounts suggest the emperor feared that Aetius had become too powerful. Others believe Valentinian was influenced by advisors who wanted to remove the general's control over the government. But by eliminating Aetius, the emperor may have destroyed one of the last pillars supporting Western Roman power. Only months later, Valentinian himself was dead. The traditional explanation identifies two former followers of Aetius, Attila and Stilicho, as the men who carried out the assassination. Ancient writers describe them as seeking revenge for their fallen commander. If this account is accurate, Valentinian's death was the consequence of a personal vendetta born from his decision to eliminate Aetius. However, historians have long questioned whether revenge alone explains such a significant political murder. The assassination benefited another powerful figure, Petronius Maximus. A wealthy Roman senator with great ambitions, Maximus would become emperor shortly after Valentinian's death. Some historical traditions suggest that he may have played a role in the plot, using the anger surrounding Aetius's murder as an opportunity to seize power. Yet, the evidence remains uncertain. Ancient sources often mixed political accusations with rumor, and the chaotic final years of the Western Roman Empire created an environment where truth and propaganda were difficult to separate. Another possibility is that multiple groups had reasons to remove Valentinian. Military leaders, aristocratic families, and political rivals all competed for influence as imperial authority weakened. The emperor's position had become increasingly vulnerable, not because he lacked the title of ruler, but because the institutions supporting that title were slowly breaking apart. There is also a deeper question surrounding Valentinian's character and leadership. Some historians view him as a weak emperor controlled by stronger personalities around him. Others argue that he was a ruler trapped by circumstances inherited from previous generations, a young monarch attempting to govern during one of Rome's most difficult periods. The assassination of Valentinian III was more than the removal of a single emperor. It represented the collapse of trust among Rome's remaining elites. A ruler who killed his greatest general was then killed by men connected to that same conflict, creating a cycle of betrayal that reflected the instability of the age. The events of AD 455 remain partially hidden behind incomplete records and competing accounts. Was Valentinian III murdered as an act of revenge, a carefully planned political takeover, or the result of several powerful interests moving against a weakened emperor? The surviving evidence provides fragments of the story, but the full truth may still be concealed within the lost conversations and forgotten ambitions of Rome's final generation. As the remnants of the Hunnic Empire faded into the changing landscape of the 5th century, the Roman world faced another crisis unfolding within its own walls. In the heart of ancient Rome, among marble halls, military camps, and the fading symbols of imperial authority, a powerful emperor met a violent end. The death of Valentinian III would not only remove a ruler from the throne, it would expose the fragile alliances, hidden rivalries, and political uncertainty consuming the Western Roman Empire. On a spring day in AD 455, Valentinian III was attacked while visiting the Campus Martius, a large public area in Rome traditionally connected with military training and political gatherings. According to ancient accounts, the emperor was struck down by 2 soldiers who had once served under him. His death was sudden, public, and shocking, but behind the blades of his assassins was a deeper question that historians have debated for centuries. Who truly wanted Valentinian dead? To understand the mystery, it is necessary to look back at the troubled years of his reign. Valentinian III became emperor as a child in AD 425, following a period of instability within the Western Roman Empire. Because he was too young to rule independently, much of the real power was held by influential figures around him, especially his mother, Galla Placidia, and later powerful military commanders. The empire he inherited was already under pressure from economic difficulties, internal conflicts, and increasing threats along its borders. For much of his reign, the most influential figure in Western Roman politics was Flavius Aetius. A skilled commander and politician, Aetius became the empire's leading military authority. He played a major role in defending Roman territory, including the famous confrontation with Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in AD 451. Yet, the relationship between Valentinian and Aetius was complicated. Although the emperor depended on his general's abilities, Aetius's immense influence created tension. To some observers, the general appeared almost like a ruler behind the throne. To others, he was the only person capable of holding together an empire facing collapse. That fragile balance ended in AD 454. According to historical sources, Valentinian III personally attacked and killed Aetius during a meeting in the imperial palace. The reasons behind this decision remain debated. Some accounts suggest the emperor feared that Aetius had become too powerful. Others believe Valentinian was influenced by advisors who wanted to remove the general's control over the government. But by eliminating Aetius, the emperor may have destroyed one of the last pillars supporting Western Roman power. Only months later, Valentinian himself was dead. The traditional explanation identifies 2 former followers of Aetius, Attila and Stilicho, as the men who carried out the assassination. Ancient writers describe them as seeking revenge for their fallen commander. If this account is accurate, Valentinian's death was the consequence of a personal vendetta born from his decision to eliminate Aetius. However, historians have long questioned whether revenge alone explains such a significant political murder. The assassination benefited another powerful figure, Petronius Maximus. A wealthy Roman senator with great ambitions, Maximus would become emperor shortly after Valentinian's death. Some historical traditions suggest that he may have played a role in the plot, using the anger surrounding Aetius's murder as an opportunity to seize power. Yet, the evidence remains uncertain. Ancient sources often mixed political accusations with rumor, and the chaotic final years of the Western Roman Empire created an environment where truth and propaganda were difficult to separate. Another possibility is that multiple groups had reasons to remove Valentinian. Military leaders, aristocratic families, and political rivals all competed for influence as imperial authority weakened. The emperor's position had become increasingly vulnerable, not because he lacked the title of ruler, but because the institutions supporting that title were slowly breaking apart. There is also a deeper question surrounding Valentinian's character and leadership. Some historians view him as a weak emperor controlled by stronger personalities around him. Others argue that he was a ruler trapped by circumstances inherited from previous generations, a young monarch attempting to govern during one of Rome's most difficult periods. The assassination of Valentinian III was more than the removal of a single emperor. It represented the collapse of trust among Rome's remaining elites. A ruler who killed his greatest general was then killed by men connected to that same conflict, creating a cycle of betrayal that reflected the instability of the age. This connection has led some historians to view Aetius's murder as a turning point in the final decline of the Western Roman Empire. The killing did not immediately destroy Rome, but it revealed how deeply divided the imperial system had become. The mystery becomes even deeper because the surviving sources were written from different perspectives. Some praised Aetius as Rome's final great defender. Others viewed him as a powerful figure whose influence had become excessive. The truth may exist somewhere between these opposing images. Was Aetius truly a loyal servant of Rome, who was sacrificed by a fearful emperor, or had he accumulated so much power that Valentinian believed removing him was necessary? Did hidden political forces guide the emperor's decision, or was the assassination simply the result of a personal struggle between two men? The death of Aetius remains one of the defining mysteries of Rome's final century. Within the walls of the imperial palace, a decision was made that changed the course of history. Yet, the full story of who ordered his fall and why remains buried beneath centuries of uncertainty. The silence inside the imperial palace of Rome must have been overwhelming after the final moments of Aetius' life. The halls that had once echoed with military discussions, diplomatic negotiations, and the movements of imperial officials had witnessed one of the most dramatic acts of political violence in the final century of the Western Roman Empire. A powerful general, a defender of Rome's borders, and the man many considered the empire's greatest soldier had been struck down, not by an invading army, but by the emperor he served. The death of Flavius Aetius remains one of the most puzzling events of the 5th century. But perhaps the deeper mystery is not how Aetius died. It is why Valentinian III, a ruler who depended on Aetius for much of his reign, personally took part in his destruction. What could drive an emperor to eliminate the very man who had protected his throne? For more than 2 decades, Aetius had been the strongest military figure in the Western Roman Empire. While Valentinian held the imperial title, Aetius often controlled the practical decisions of warfare and diplomacy. He managed conflicts with rival groups, defended Roman territories, and built alliances that helped preserve an empire already facing severe pressure. To many, Aetius was not merely a general. He was the foundation holding together a weakening state. But power inside the Roman Empire was rarely simple. A successful general could be seen as both a necessary protector and a potential threat. Throughout Roman history, emperors had feared commanders who gained too much influence, especially those who controlled loyal armies. The memory of earlier military leaders who had challenged emperors remained deeply embedded in Roman politics. Valentinian III may have looked at Aetius through this same lens. Ancient accounts suggest that the emperor had grown increasingly suspicious of his commander. Aetius's victories had increased his reputation, and his political influence had expanded far beyond that of an ordinary military officer. Some historians believe Valentinian feared that Aetius had become powerful enough to dominate the empire completely, or even replace the emperor himself. Yet, the relationship between the two men had not always been hostile. For years, Valentinian relied on Aetius to defend his position. When threats appeared along Roman borders, it was often Aetius who responded. During the invasion of Attila the Hun in AD 451, Aetius played a central role in organizing resistance against one of the most feared rulers of the ancient world. His success strengthened his reputation, but may also have increased the emperor's unease. Could the very achievements that saved Rome have made Aetius too dangerous to keep alive? Another possible explanation involves personal rivalry. Valentinian III had spent most of his reign surrounded by stronger personalities. As a child emperor, he was guided by others. As an adult, he continued to rely on powerful advisors and generals. Some historians suggest that killing Aetius was an attempt to reclaim the authority that the emperor believed had been taken from him. The circumstances of the assassination reveal a great deal about this struggle. According to historical sources, Aetius was summoned to a meeting with Valentinian in the imperial palace. During the confrontation, the emperor accused him of betrayal or excessive ambition. In the middle of the dispute, Valentinian and his supporters attacked him. The general who had commanded armies across the empire was killed within the walls of the very government he had served. But was this truly an act of imperial independence, or was Valentinian influenced by others? Some interpretations suggest that members of the imperial court encouraged the emperor's decision. Political figures who disliked Aetius may have seen an opportunity to remove a powerful rival. By convincing Valentinian to act, they could weaken the general's influence and reshape the balance of power within the empire. Others believe the explanation may have been more personal. Ancient rulers often faced intense pressure from fear, pride, and suspicion. Could Valentinian have viewed Aetius not as a loyal servant, but as a constant reminder of his own limited authority? There is also another possibility, that Valentinian misunderstood the role Aetius played in maintaining stability. Aetius's power came from the same military networks that protected the empire. By removing him, Valentinian removed one of the few people capable of controlling those forces. The emperor may have believed he was restoring imperial strength, only to create a dangerous vacuum. The consequences were immediate. Less than a year after Aetius's death, Valentinian III himself was assassinated by men connected to the political conflicts surrounding the fallen general. The destruction of one powerful figure led directly into the downfall of another. The story of Valentinian and Aetius is therefore not only a tale of betrayal, but also a question about power itself. When does a protector become a threat? When does a ruler decide that the person preserving his authority has become the greatest danger to it? The surviving sources offer fragments, accusations, and competing interpretations. They reveal a moment of fear and ambition inside a collapsing empire, but they cannot fully uncover the thoughts of the emperor who made that fatal decision. Was Valentinian III acting to defend his throne from a rising rival, or was he manipulated by those who wanted Aetius removed? Was the killing a calculated political move, or a desperate mistake made by a ruler losing control of his own world? The answer remains hidden within the final days of Rome's fading power, waiting somewhere between history, speculation, and the silence of the past. As the final years of the Western Roman Empire unfolded, The fate of powerful men was often decided not on distant battlefields, but inside the shadowed halls of imperial politics. Before Aetius fell beneath the suspicion of his own emperor, another influential Roman commander had already faced a similar end. In the year AD 408, within the walls of the imperial court at Ravenna, a man who had spent decades defending Rome was suddenly condemned as an enemy. His name was Stilicho. For many years, Stilicho stood as the most powerful figure in the Western Roman Empire. A skilled general of Vandal ancestry serving Rome, he rose through the ranks to become the guardian of the young emperor Honorius. During a period of growing instability, Stilicho commanded armies, negotiated with rival powers, and attempted to preserve unity within an empire facing increasing pressure from outside forces. Yet, in AD 408, the man who had defended Rome for decades was arrested and executed by order of the imperial government. The question that remains is one of the darkest mysteries of Rome's decline. Who truly wanted Stilicho removed? To understand his downfall, it is necessary to examine the world he inhabited. The Western Roman Empire, at the beginning of the 5th century, was no longer the unstoppable force of earlier centuries. Borders were under pressure, political divisions were growing, and the relationship between emperors and military commanders had become increasingly fragile. When Emperor Theodosius I died in AD 395, the empire was divided between his two sons. Honorius inherited the Western Empire while still a child, and Stilicho became one of the most influential advisors in the young emperor's government. In practice, Stilicho controlled much of the military decision-making and acted as the empire's leading defender. His career included victories against internal rivals and negotiations with powerful groups beyond Rome's borders. He confronted threats from the Visigoths and attempted to maintain Roman authority during a period when traditional methods of control were becoming less effective. But Stilicho's influence created a dangerous situation. In Roman politics, a general who commanded armies could become more powerful than the emperor himself. Although Stilicho publicly supported Honorius, some members of the court viewed his position with suspicion. Was he truly protecting the emperor, or was he gradually becoming the real ruler behind the throne? These fears became stronger as Rome faced a new crisis. In AD 408, the Visigoth leader Alaric I entered Roman territory and demanded payment in exchange for peace. Stilicho argued for negotiation, believing that diplomacy was necessary to avoid further destruction. However, his opponents portrayed this approach as weakness or even betrayal. Rumors began spreading that Stilicho had secret ambitions. Some accused him of planning to place his own family members on the imperial throne or of making dangerous agreements with foreign enemies. Whether these accusations were based on reality or political manipulation remains uncertain. The situation reached its breaking point in Ravenna. According to ancient sources, Emperor Honorius and his advisors turned against Stilicho. The general was arrested while seeking refuge in a church and was later executed. His supporters were removed from positions of influence, and his family suffered persecution. But was Honorius truly the person responsible for Stilicho's death? The traditional explanation places responsibility on the emperor and the officials around him. Honorius, though personally weak as a ruler, held the authority to approve Stilicho's execution. His advisors may have convinced him that removing the powerful general was necessary to protect imperial control. However, some historians suggest a more complicated picture. One possibility is that court officials who feared Stilicho's influence orchestrated his downfall. Figures within the imperial administration may have used the crisis with Alaric as an opportunity to eliminate a rival and gain greater control over the emperor. By turning public opinion against Stilicho, they could transform a respected commander into a political enemy. Another theory considers the role of military tensions. Stilicho's army included many soldiers of non-Roman origin, and some Roman elites may have viewed his background with increasing distrust. Could resentment toward his ancestry and his connections with foreign groups have contributed to the accusations against him? There is also the question of whether Stilicho himself made mistakes. Some historians argue that his political choices, including his handling of the Visigoth threat, created enemies who were waiting for a chance to strike. His power was immense, but so was the fear surrounding him. The tragedy of Stilicho's death is that Rome may have destroyed one of its own strongest defenders at the moment it needed stability most. After his execution, the Western Empire became even more vulnerable. The Visigoths soon moved deeper into Roman territory, and in AD 410, they famously captured Rome itself. Yet, history rarely provides simple answers. Was Stilicho a loyal servant who was sacrificed by fearful politicians? Was he an ambitious commander whose power had grown beyond what the empire could tolerate? Or was his death the result of a larger struggle between military authority and imperial control? The surviving records reveal accusations, political rivalries, and competing versions of the truth. But behind those fragments remains a deeper mystery. In the final decades of Rome's Western Empire, how many great leaders were destroyed not by foreign enemies, but by the fear and suspicion within their own walls? As the Western Roman Empire continued its slow unraveling, the Mediterranean world entered an age where alliances could change overnight, and the decisions of a single individual could alter the fate of entire provinces. Across the waters of the Mediterranean, on the fertile shores of North Africa, one of Rome's richest territories would soon become the center of a mystery that still divides historians today. The landscape of ancient North Africa was unlike any other region of the Roman world. Vast fields of grain stretched across the countryside, supplying food for distant cities, while wealthy coastal settlements connected Africa to the heart of the empire. Among these cities stood Carthage, a symbol of Roman power and prosperity for centuries. Yet, in AD 429, an unexpected force crossed the waters from Europe into this valuable territory. Tens of thousands of Vandals, along with their allies, entered North Africa and began a campaign that would eventually create a powerful kingdom independent from Roman control. At the center of this transformation was a Roman general named Bonifacius. According to several ancient accounts, Bonifacius played a direct role in bringing the Vandals into Africa. The story suggests that during a political conflict with the imperial government in Ravenna, he called upon the Vandals as military allies, intending to use them as a temporary force against his Roman enemies. But once they arrived, the Vandals refused to leave. A decision meant to solve a political struggle may have opened the door to one of the greatest territorial losses in Roman history. But did Bonifacius truly invite the Vandals into North Africa? The answer is far more complicated than the traditional story suggests. To understand the mystery, it is important to examine the unstable political world of the early 5th century. The Western Roman Empire was facing internal conflicts, competing generals, and increasing pressure from migrating groups across its borders. Military commanders often acted with significant independence, sometimes negotiating with foreign powers when imperial support was unavailable. Bonifacius was one of these powerful figures. As the military commander of Roman Africa, he controlled one of the empire's most important regions. North Africa was not simply another province. It was a vital source of grain and wealth. Whoever controlled the region held enormous influence over Rome itself. At first, Bonifacius was considered a loyal servant of the empire. However, political conflicts between him and powerful figures at the imperial court changed his position. According to the historian Procopius and other later writers, Bonifacius became involved in a dispute with the government. possibly involving accusations of disloyalty. One version of events claims that officials in Rome attempted to remove him, leading Bonifacius to seek outside assistance. The Vandals, led by their king Gaiseric, were invited across the sea as allies. But once the Vandals entered Africa, the situation changed completely. Rather than acting as temporary soldiers, they began establishing their own power. They moved through Roman territories, defeated local forces, and eventually created a kingdom that controlled much of North Africa. In AD 455, they would go even further by capturing and looting Rome itself. For centuries, this account has shaped the image of Bonifacius as the man who accidentally allowed Rome's enemies into one of its most valuable provinces. However, historians have questioned whether this interpretation is entirely accurate. Some researchers argue that Bonifacius may never have formally invited the Vandals at all. The surviving sources were written years after the events, often by authors with their own political perspectives. It is possible that later writers simplified a complicated conflict by placing responsibility on one individual. Another possibility is that Bonifacius did seek assistance, but underestimated the scale of the Vandal migration. In the 5th century, military alliances with foreign groups were common. Rome frequently used outside warriors as soldiers, expecting them to serve imperial interests before returning home. Perhaps Bonifacius believed the Vandals could be controlled in the same way. If so, the mystery becomes one of miscalculation rather than betrayal. There is also the possibility that the Vandals were already searching for a new territory. Pressures from other groups, conflicts along the European frontier, and the search for resources may have encouraged their movement regardless of Roman politics. Under this interpretation, Bonifacius may not have created the crisis. He may have simply become caught in a much larger historical movement. The truth is difficult to uncover because the voices of the Vandals themselves are largely absent from the surviving record. Much of what we know comes from Roman writers, who often viewed them as invaders and enemies. Their motivations, plans, and internal decisions remain far less visible. What is certain is that the arrival of the Vandals changed the balance of power in the Mediterranean forever. Within a few decades, the region that had once been one of Rome's greatest sources of wealth became the center of a new kingdom. Yet the question remains: was Bonifacius the architect of a disaster, a desperate commander making a difficult choice during a time of chaos, or simply a figure blamed for events that were already beyond his control? Somewhere between political rivalries, lost documents, and conflicting ancient accounts lies the truth of what really happened in AD 429, and the mystery of whether one Roman general opened the gates to a new power, or whether history placed that burden unfairly upon him, remains unresolved. The marble streets of ancient Rome carried the weight of centuries when the gates of the city opened to a foreign army in AD 455. The capital of the Western Roman Empire, once protected by powerful legions and surrounded by the reputation of an eternal civilization, stood vulnerable. Within its walls were imperial palaces, ancient temples, and the accumulated wealth of generations. Yet, the arrival of the Vandals was not simply the story of an invading army entering a weakened city. Behind the event was a complicated chain of political betrayals, rival ambitions, and unanswered questions. The sack of Rome by the Vandals has often been remembered as a symbol of decline, but the deeper mystery lies in the circumstances that brought them there. Was the fall of Rome in AD 455 the result of a foreign attack alone, or was it connected to a hidden struggle among Rome's own leaders? At the center of this political storm was the death of Emperor Valentinian III. His assassination in March AD 455 created a sudden power vacuum in the Western Roman Empire. After years of instability, the imperial throne became the prize in a dangerous competition between influential figures seeking control. One of those figures was Petronius Maximus, a wealthy Roman senator who quickly claimed the imperial title after Valentinian's death. His rise was controversial, and some ancient sources suggest that he may have played a role in the events leading to Valentinian's assassination. The details remain uncertain, but the consequences were immediate. Petronius Maximus inherited an empire already weakened by military defeats, political divisions, and declining authority. Yet his position was unstable from the beginning. The people of Rome questioned his legitimacy, and powerful groups within the empire were uncertain whether to support him. Then came another problem: the Vandals. The Vandal king Gaiseric had established a powerful kingdom in North Africa after crossing into Roman territory more than 2 decades earlier. His control over Carthage and the surrounding region gave him influence over the Mediterranean, and he maintained a fleet capable of reaching Roman shores. But why did Gaiseric decide to march on Rome in AD 455? The traditional explanation connects the invasion to a broken political agreement. According to later accounts, Valentinian III had promised that his daughter Eudocia would marry Gaiseric's son, Hunnic. This alliance would have strengthened ties between the Roman court and the Vandal kingdom. However, after Valentinian's death, Petronius Maximus arranged for Eudocia to marry his own son instead, supposedly violating the previous agreement. If this account is accurate, Gaiseric's invasion was not only a military action, it was an act of political retaliation. The Vandal fleet crossed the Mediterranean, and Rome found itself unable to defend against the approaching threat. Unlike earlier invasions that involved massive battles outside the city, the events of AD 455 unfolded through negotiation and fear. Pope Leo I reportedly met with Gaiseric and attempted to prevent destruction. The Vandals entered the city, and while they looted valuable treasures, ancient sources suggest the damage was more controlled than the complete destruction sometimes imagined. Yet, questions remain about what truly motivated the attack. Some historians believe the marriage dispute was only part of a much larger political struggle. Gaiseric may have viewed the instability in Rome as an opportunity to expand Vandal influence and weaken a rival power. The collapse of Valentinian's government created the perfect moment for action. Others have considered whether Roman political figures indirectly contributed to the disaster. By removing Valentinian and failing to establish a stable successor, Rome's own elites may have created the conditions that allowed an external power to intervene. Could the sack of Rome have been avoided if the imperial succession had unfolded differently? There are also questions surrounding Petronius Maximus himself. Some accounts portray him as a selfish politician whose ambition accelerated Rome's downfall. Others suggest that he was a desperate leader attempting to control an impossible situation. The surviving sources often reflect the political opinions of their authors, making it difficult to separate fact from accusation. The days following the Vandal arrival became even more chaotic. According to some accounts, Petronius Maximus was killed while attempting to flee the city. His reign lasted only a short time, and the empire was left even more divided. The sack of Rome by the Vandals was therefore not merely a military defeat. It was the result of a collapsing political system where personal rivalries, broken alliances, and foreign ambitions became impossible to separate. The mystery remains in the connections between these events. Did Gaiseric invade Rome primarily because of a broken promise, or was the marriage dispute only a convenient reason for a carefully planned expansion? Did Roman leaders unknowingly create the conditions for their own humiliation? The surviving records reveal a city caught between internal conflict and external pressure, but they leave behind a larger question. When Rome's enemies arrived at its gates in AD 455, Were they the true cause of the empire's crisis? Or were they simply the final force entering a struggle that Rome had already begun fighting within itself? Beyond the fading borders of the Western Roman Empire, across the mist-covered hills and ancient landscapes of Britain, a different kind of mystery began to take shape. The roads, once built by Rome, were slowly losing their importance. Abandoned forts stood silent against the changing world, and communities struggled to survive in the aftermath of imperial withdrawal. It was during this uncertain age that a name appeared in the historical record, a figure remembered as a defender, a leader, and possibly one of the last voices of Roman Britain. His name was Ambrosius Aurelianus. Unlike many rulers of the ancient world, Ambrosius left behind no grand monuments, no surviving writings, and no clear account of his life. Instead, his story survives through fragments, written generations after he may have lived. He stands at the edge of history, a figure caught between documented events and later legend. The mystery surrounding Ambrosius begins with the collapse of Roman authority in Britain. When Roman forces withdrew from the island during the early 5th century, Britain entered a period of profound transformation. The administrative systems that had connected the province to the wider empire began to weaken. Local leaders gained more influence, settlements changed, and new groups arrived from across the sea. According to the 6th century writer Gildas, Ambrosius Aurelianus emerged as a leader during this troubled period. Gildas described him as a man of Roman ancestry whose parents had suffered during the conflicts that followed Rome's departure. Unlike many figures of the time, Ambrosius was portrayed as someone who resisted the advancing forces threatening the Britons. But beyond these few details, the historical record becomes uncertain. Was Ambrosius a military commander, a regional ruler, a symbol of Roman identity during a changing age? Or perhaps a figure whose achievements were later expanded into something greater? One of the most important details connected to Ambrosius is his role in the conflict between the Britons and the invading Saxons. Gildas describes a major victory known as the Battle of Mons Badonicus, a confrontation in which the Britons defeated their opponents. However, Gildas does not clearly state that Ambrosius led the battle. Centuries later, writers connected this victory to the legend of King Arthur. The possibility that Ambrosius influenced the Arthurian tradition has fascinated historians for generations. Some scholars have suggested that the memory of a Roman British commander defending his people may have contributed to later stories of a heroic king. Others argue that Ambrosius and Arthur were separate figures, with different origins and meanings. The uncertainty has created many theories. One interpretation presents Ambrosius as a real military leader who inherited the traditions of Roman command and attempted to preserve Roman culture in Britain. In this view, he represents one of the last attempts to maintain order during a period of fragmentation. Another possibility is that Ambrosius was less of a traditional ruler and more of a powerful local figure whose influence came from family connections, wealth, or military reputation. In a world where written records were becoming rare, authority often depended on personal loyalty rather than official titles. There are also questions about his relationship with later British legends. Some medieval traditions transformed Ambrosius into a much larger character, sometimes connecting him with figures such as Merlin, or placing him within the same world as Arthurian stories. However, these later accounts were written many centuries after the events they describe and often blended history with imagination. The search for the real Ambrosius is complicated by the lack of archaeological evidence. Unlike Roman emperors or famous generals, he did not leave behind identifiable structures or inscriptions. His existence is preserved mainly through written memory, and that memory itself changed over time. Even his final years remain unknown. Did Ambrosius die after successfully defending Britain? Did he establish a lasting political order? Did his descendants continue his work, or did his influence disappear as new kingdoms emerged? The absence of answers is part of what makes his story so compelling. The world Ambrosius lived in was a place between two eras. The Roman system was fading, but a new medieval Britain had not yet fully formed. Leaders like him may have represented the final connection to an older civilization, carrying the traditions of Rome into an uncertain future. Yet, the surviving evidence leaves only fragments. A name written by a distant observer, a brief mention of resistance, and a legacy that may have influenced one of Britain's greatest legends. Was Ambrosius Aurelianus truly one of the last great defenders of Roman Britain? Or did later generations transform a lesser-known leader into a symbol of hope during a chaotic age? Somewhere between the ruins of forgotten settlements and the stories passed through centuries, the fate of Ambrosius remains partially hidden, waiting for history to reveal what was lost. The fading halls of imperial power in Italy carried the echoes of a civilization that had ruled the Mediterranean world for centuries. In the city of Ravenna, surrounded by fortified walls, political intrigue, and the remains of a once mighty empire, a young emperor faced a moment that would later be remembered as a turning point in history. His name was Romulus Augustulus, and in AD 476, his reign ended not with a dramatic battle, but with a quiet transfer of authority that left behind one of history's greatest questions. How did the Western Roman Empire truly come to an end? For centuries, the deposition of Romulus Augustulus has been viewed as the symbolic fall of Rome in the West. The event itself was surprisingly brief. A Germanic military commander named Odoacer entered the political center of Italy, removed the young emperor from power, and declared that no separate Western emperor was needed. Instead, Odoacer sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern Roman emperor in Constantinople, suggesting that one emperor ruling from the east was sufficient. Yet, behind this simple description lies a much more complicated story. Romulus Augustulus was never a typical emperor. He was a teenager placed on the throne by his father, Orestes, a powerful military figure who controlled the Western imperial government. Before Romulus became emperor, Orestes had helped remove the previous ruler, Julius Nepos, creating another layer of uncertainty over who held the legitimate claim to power. The young emperor's position was therefore fragile from the beginning. Unlike earlier Roman rulers who commanded vast armies and controlled distant provinces, Romulus Augustulus inherited a shrinking realm. Much of the Western Empire had already been lost or transformed into independent kingdoms. Roman authority in regions such as Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa had weakened dramatically, leaving Italy as one of the last remaining centers of imperial control. But was Romulus simply a powerless symbol, or was his removal part of a larger political struggle? The crisis that brought Odoacer to power began with the demands of the soldiers serving under the Western Roman military system. Many of these troops were of Germanic origin and had long served Rome as federated allies. They requested land settlements in Italy, a practice that had been used for generations to reward soldiers and secure loyalty. Orestes refused their demands. This decision created a confrontation between the military leadership and the imperial government. The soldiers turned to Odoacer, a commander among these forces, and recognized him as their leader. In AD 476, Odoacer defeated Orestes in battle, captured him, and removed the last sources of support behind Romulus Augustulus. But what were Odoacer's true intentions? The traditional interpretation presents him as the man who ended the Western Roman Empire. However, some historians argue that this view may simplify a much more gradual transformation. Odoacer did not immediately destroy Roman institutions. He maintained many existing administrative structures, continued using Roman titles, and governed Italy in a way that preserved elements of the old system. Perhaps he did not see himself as a conqueror destroying Rome, but as a military leader taking control of a government that had already weakened beyond repair. There are also questions surrounding the decision to remove the Western imperial title entirely. Why did Odoacer not create his own emperor? One possibility is that he believed a Western emperor was no longer necessary. The Eastern Roman emperor in Constantinople still claimed authority over the Roman world, and by sending the imperial symbols eastward, Odoacer may have presented himself as a legitimate ruler acting within the existing Roman order. Another interpretation suggests that this was a political calculation. By avoiding the title of emperor, Odoacer could rule Italy without directly challenging the authority of Constantinople. It was a careful balance between independence and recognition. Yet, the personal fate of Romulus Augustulus adds another layer of mystery. Unlike many defeated rulers, he was not executed. Ancient sources suggest that Odoacer spared his life and sent him to live in a private estate in southern Italy. Why was he treated differently? Was it an act of mercy, political strategy, or simply because the young emperor was no longer considered a threat? The historical record does not provide a clear answer. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus is often described as a single dramatic moment, the fall of Rome after 1,000 years of imperial rule. But the reality was far more gradual. The event represented the end of a political structure that had already been changing for generations. The Roman world did not disappear overnight. Laws, traditions, cities, and institutions continued under new rulers. In many ways, AD 476 was less a sudden collapse and more a transition between eras. Still, the mystery remains in Odoacer's motives and the meaning of his actions. Was he a foreign commander who ended an ancient empire, or was he a practical ruler adapting to a world where the old system had already broken apart? Did Romulus Augustulus mark the final chapter of Rome's Western emperors, or was his removal simply one step in a transformation that had begun long before? The answer may depend on how we understand the moment itself. Was it the fall of Rome, or the beginning of a different Roman world hidden beneath the surface of history? Long before the Western Roman Empire reached its final political collapse, the city of Rome experienced another moment of profound uncertainty. Along the ancient roads leading toward the heart of the empire, an army approached that many Romans believed could never breach their sacred city. Behind the towering walls, temples, monuments, and imperial buildings stood as reminders of centuries of power. Yet, in AD 410, those walls opened, and for the first time in nearly 800 years, Rome was entered and plundered by a foreign army. At the center of this event was Alaric I, the leader of the Visigoths. His name became forever linked with one of the most shocking events of late Roman history. But the deeper mystery is not simply how Alaric entered Rome. It is why he did it. Was the sack of Rome an act of revenge, a desperate political message, or a carefully calculated attempt to reshape the future of the Roman world? For centuries, the image of the Visigoths breaking into Rome has represented the beginning of the empire's decline. Ancient writers described the event with fear and sorrow, presenting it as a sign that the old order was collapsing. However, the reality behind the invasion was far more complicated than a simple attack by enemies against a weakened civilization. The Visigoths had not always been Rome's enemies. For generations, groups from beyond the Roman frontier had served within the imperial military system. Many were recruited as soldiers, allies, and defenders of Roman territory. The relationship between Rome and these groups was often based on agreements involving land, protection, and military service. The Visigoths entered Roman lands during a period of immense pressure. In the late 4th century, they faced threats from other migrating groups and sought refuge within the empire. Roman officials allowed them to settle, but the arrangement quickly failed. Poor treatment, corruption, and broken promises created resentment, leading to conflict between the Visigoths and Roman authorities. The turning point came at the Battle of Adrianople in AD 378, where the Roman army suffered a devastating defeat. This event changed the balance of power and showed that Rome could no longer easily control the groups it had once managed. Years later, Alaric emerged as a leader among the Visigoths. His relationship with Rome remained complicated. He was not simply a foreign invader seeking destruction. At different moments, he negotiated with Roman officials, served Roman interests, and attempted to secure a recognized position for his people within the empire. This raises a central question. If Alaric wanted to destroy Rome, why did he spend years negotiating with it? The events leading to the sack of AD 410 reveal a struggle over recognition and political power. Alaric repeatedly demanded a settlement from the Roman government, including land and official status for his followers. The Western Roman authorities, however, often rejected or delayed these requests. Some historians believe that the sack of Rome was therefore not originally Alaric's main goal. Instead, it may have been a dramatic attempt to force negotiations and demonstrate that the Visigoths could no longer be ignored. Yet, there were deeper motivations as well. Rome had become more than a political capital. It was a symbol of imperial authority, wealth, and tradition. By entering the city, Alaric sent a message that even the most powerful institutions of the ancient world were vulnerable. But did he intend to destroy Rome completely? The evidence suggests otherwise. Ancient accounts describe the Visigoths spending several days inside the city, taking valuables and prisoners, but not completely burning it to the ground. Important religious sites were reportedly respected, and the destruction was limited compared with what might have occurred during a total conquest. This has led some historians to suggest that Alaric wanted influence rather than annihilation. Another possibility is that the sack was driven by frustration after years of failed diplomacy. Alaric had repeatedly attempted to reach an agreement with Roman leaders, and each failure may have convinced him that only a dramatic action would force the empire to respond. There are also questions about the political environment within Rome itself. At the time, the Western Roman government was based primarily in Ravenna, not Rome. The ancient capital still carried enormous symbolic importance, but it was no longer the main center of imperial decision-making. Could the sack have exposed the growing distance between Rome's glorious past and its uncertain present? Some interpretations even suggest that internal Roman conflicts contributed to the disaster. Rival factions within the empire competed for influence, and poor decisions by officials may have created opportunities for Alaric. In this view, the Visigoths were not the sole cause of Rome's humiliation. They were the force that revealed existing weaknesses. The final years of Alaric's life remain mysterious as well. After leaving Rome, he continued his ambitions, but died soon afterward in southern Italy. His burial place was reportedly hidden, and according to later traditions, a river was temporarily diverted to conceal his grave. Whether this story is entirely accurate remains uncertain, but it reflects how quickly Alaric became a figure surrounded by legend. The sack of Rome in AD 410 was not simply a moment when an enemy entered an ancient city. It was the result of decades of political failures, broken agreements, and changing relationships between Rome and the peoples living beyond its borders. Was Alaric seeking revenge against an empire that had betrayed his people? Was he attempting to secure a future for the Visigoths through a powerful demonstration of strength? Or was the sack of Rome the unavoidable consequence of a world where the old systems of power were already beginning to collapse? The ruins of ancient Rome preserve the memory of that night, but the true motives behind Alaric's decision remain hidden between the surviving records and the unanswered questions of history. The streets of Rome had barely recovered from the shock of AD 410, when the army that had shaken the ancient capital began moving away. The walls that had witnessed the arrival of the Visigoths now stood behind them, guarding a city forever changed. For 3 days, the followers of Alaric had entered the heart of the Roman world, taking wealth, prisoners, and symbols of imperial prestige. Yet, after achieving what many considered an impossible victory, Alaric did something unexpected. He left. The decision remains one of the most intriguing mysteries of his career. If Rome was the greatest prize of the ancient world, why did Alaric I not remain there and attempt to rule it? Why abandon a city that represented centuries of power and authority? The answer may reveal that Alaric's true goals were far more complex than simple conquest. Before the sack of Rome, Alaric's relationship with the Roman Empire had been shaped by years of negotiation, conflict, and disappointment. The Visigoths were not merely an invading force seeking destruction. They had spent decades attempting to secure a recognized place within the Roman system. Alaric wanted land, political recognition, and a stable future for his people. The sack of Rome was a dramatic statement, but it may have been a means to an end rather than the end itself. After the city was taken, Alaric did not establish a new capital inside Rome. He did not claim the imperial throne. Instead, his army moved south through Italy, carrying the wealth gained from the city and searching for new opportunities. One possible explanation is that Rome itself was never Alaric's ultimate objective. The ancient capital was a symbol, but symbols did not provide food, territory, or security for a migrating population. The Visigoths needed a permanent homeland. They needed resources to support thousands of people, including warriors, families, and followers who depended on their leader's success. Some historians believe Alaric's next goal was North Africa. At the time, North Africa was one of the wealthiest regions controlled by Rome. Its agricultural production supplied vital resources, especially grain, and its cities contained enormous wealth. Controlling this region could have provided Alaric with the economic foundation needed to create a lasting kingdom. According to some ancient accounts, Alaric planned to cross the Mediterranean and move toward Africa. However, before he could complete this plan, his fleet preparations failed, and circumstances forced him to change direction. But why did these plans fail? The details remain uncertain. The surviving sources provide only fragments, leaving historians to reconstruct events from incomplete evidence. Some suggest that bad weather destroyed the ships being prepared for the journey. Others believe logistical difficulties made the campaign impossible. There may also have been political reasons behind Alaric's movement. Although he had defeated Rome, he was still dealing with a powerful empire that controlled significant resources. The Western Roman government was weakened but not destroyed. Emperor Honorius remained in power, and Roman forces continued to resist Visigoth ambitions. Perhaps Alaric understood that holding Rome would create a new set of problems. A city like Rome required enormous resources to govern. It was filled with political factions, administrative challenges, and enemies who would constantly attempt to reclaim it. By leaving, Alaric may have preserved his freedom of movement and kept his army united. Another possibility is that Alaric's departure was connected to negotiations. Some historians believe that after the sack, he may have attempted to reach a final agreement with the Roman government. The wealth taken from Rome could have strengthened his position, allowing him to negotiate from a place of power. In this interpretation, the sack was not an act of destruction, but a message. The Visigoths could no longer be ignored. Yet, there are also deeper mysteries surrounding his final journey. After leaving Rome, Alaric moved into southern Italy. Ancient writers describe him attempting to continue his ambitions, but his plans came to an abrupt end when he died in AD 410, near the city of Cosenza. His followers reportedly buried him in a hidden location beneath a riverbed, diverting the water to conceal his grave. If this account is accurate, the burial reflects the importance of protecting Alaric's memory and preventing his enemies from disturbing his final resting place. But it also leaves another unanswered question. What was Alaric truly trying to achieve in his final days? Was he searching for a homeland where the Visigoths could build a new future? Was he attempting to force Rome into accepting his people as equals? Or did the events after the sack reveal that even the greatest victories could create unexpected challenges? The abandonment of Rome remains a reminder that conquest does not always mean possession. Alaric achieved what generations of enemies had failed to do. He entered the heart of the Roman world. Yet, instead of staying, he turned away, carrying his ambitions toward a future that he would never live to see. The reasons behind that decision remain hidden within the uncertain records of the 5th century. Somewhere between political strategy, failed plans, and forgotten negotiations lies the true explanation for why Alaric left Rome behind after changing its history forever. Across the windswept hills of Britain, the remains of ancient roads and abandoned fortifications still mark the landscape where one of history's greatest empires once attempted to establish its northern frontier. Stone walls, military camps, and scattered ruins stand as silent reminders of a time when Roman soldiers marched across the island, bringing with them new systems of government, trade, architecture, and culture. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman Britain was a province connected to one of the most powerful civilizations the world had ever known. Yet, by the beginning of the 5th century, that connection had almost completely disappeared. Roman officials were gone, military defenses had weakened, and the structures that once represented imperial authority began to fade. The mystery is not only why Rome left Britain, but how such a deeply established system could collapse so rapidly. When Roman forces first arrived under the command of Aulus Plautius in AD 43, Britain became one of the farthest provinces of the empire. Over the following centuries, Roman rule transformed parts of the island. New towns appeared, roads connected distant settlements, and forts protected the borders. Places such as Hadrian's Wall represented not only military strength, but the reach of Roman organization. The empire had created a network that connected Britain to distant regions across Europe. But this system depended on constant support from Rome itself. By the late 4th century, the Roman world was facing serious challenges. The empire was divided, political conflicts increased, and military resources were stretched across multiple frontiers. Britain, located at the edge of the Roman world, became increasingly difficult to protect. One major question remains: was Britain abandoned because Rome was collapsing, or did Britain's own problems accelerate the decline? A traditional explanation focuses on military withdrawal. As threats increased elsewhere, Roman authorities needed soldiers in more critical regions. Troops stationed in Britain may have been gradually transferred to defend other parts of the empire, leaving the island more vulnerable. In AD 410, the situation reached a symbolic turning point. The Roman government in the West informed British communities that they could no longer expect imperial military assistance. Although the exact details of this message are debated, it represented a major change. Britain was effectively left to manage its own defense. But the process was not as simple as an army leaving overnight. Roman influence had already been changing for decades. Economic difficulties affected trade networks. Local governments became more independent, and communities had to adapt to new conditions. The province was not suddenly destroyed. It slowly transformed. Another factor was pressure from outside groups. During the late Roman period, Britain faced attacks and migration from groups such as the Saxons, Picts, and Irish raiders. Coastal defenses were strengthened, and new military responses were attempted. However, without the full resources of the empire behind them, local leaders struggled to maintain the same level of protection. Some historians believe that internal instability played an equally important role. Roman Britain was not simply controlled by soldiers from abroad. Many local elites adopted Roman customs, participated in administration, and benefited from imperial connections. When Roman authority weakened, these communities had to decide how to govern themselves. Did they attempt to preserve Roman traditions independently? Did they create new political systems? Or did the collapse of imperial structures leave a power vacuum that others quickly filled? Archaeological evidence reveals a complicated picture. Some Roman towns declined, while others continued in modified forms. Certain aspects of Roman culture survived long after imperial officials disappeared. The transition was not a complete disappearance of Rome, but a gradual transformation into a different society. There are also more debated theories about the reasons behind Britain's collapse from Roman control. Some researchers have examined environmental changes, economic disruptions, and population movements as possible contributing factors. Climate shifts may have affected agriculture, while changes in trade patterns may have reduced wealth flowing into the province. However, no single explanation fully accounts for the disappearance of Roman authority. The mystery becomes deeper when considering how quickly the political structure vanished. Rome had ruled Britain for almost 400 years. It had built roads, forts, towns, and systems of administration that shaped daily life. Yet, within a few generations, the island entered a new era where regional kingdoms replaced imperial government. Perhaps the most important question is whether Roman Britain truly collapsed or whether it transformed. The people who lived there did not vanish. Many continued farming the same lands, living near the same settlements, and preserving elements of the culture they had inherited. The end of Roman rule was not the end of Britain itself, but the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter. Still, the reasons behind the speed of this transformation remain debated. Was Britain abandoned because Rome no longer had the strength to defend its distant province? Did economic and social changes weaken the foundations long before the final withdrawal? Or were there hidden pressures and forgotten events that accelerated the disappearance of Roman authority? Among the ruins of abandoned forts and the remains of ancient roads, the final days of Roman Britain continue to raise questions. The empire that once reached the edge of the known world left behind countless traces, but the exact moment when its power slipped away remains one of history's most fascinating mysteries. The final years of the Visigoths' journey through the Roman world were marked by ambition, survival, and uncertain alliances. After the dramatic events that surrounded the sack of Rome in AD 410, the Visigoths did not disappear into the shadows. Instead, they continued searching for a place where their people could build a future. Along the roads of southern Gaul and the cities of Hispania, their leader attempted to transform a wandering army into a recognized kingdom. That leader was Athaulf. His story is one of the most unusual chapters in the history of the late Roman Empire. Unlike some rulers who sought only conquest, Athaulf appeared to understand that survival required something more than military victories. He attempted to create a new relationship between the Visigoths and Rome, a partnership between two worlds that had spent generations in conflict. Yet, his vision ended suddenly. In AD 415, Athaulf was assassinated in the city of Barcelona. His death came at a moment when the future of the Visigothic people remained uncertain, leaving historians with a difficult question. Who wanted the king dead, and why? To understand the mystery, it is necessary to examine the unusual path that brought Athaulf to power. After the death of Alaric I in AD 410, the Visigoths faced a dangerous transition. Alaric had led them through years of conflict with Rome, including the famous capture of the imperial capital. But his sudden death left the group without its most influential figure. Athaulf, who was related to Alaric, became the new leader. His approach was different from that of his predecessor. Rather than continuing a direct campaign against Rome, Athaulf sought a political solution. He married Galla Placidia, the half-sister of Emperor Honorius, who had been captured during the sack of Rome. The marriage was a remarkable political statement. It connected the Visigothic royal family with the Roman imperial dynasty and suggested that cooperation between the two powers might be possible. According to the historian Ambrosius, Athaulf once expressed the idea that he had originally hoped to replace Roman civilization with Visigothic power, but later realized that the Visigoths lacked the structures needed to govern such a vast empire. Instead, he wanted to restore Roman strength while adding Visigothic influence. Whether these words accurately represent his thoughts is uncertain, but they reflect a major shift in his strategy. Athaulf was no longer simply a conqueror. He was attempting to become a ruler within a changing Roman world. But this transformation created enemies. Some Visigoth warriors may have opposed his growing cooperation with Rome. For those who had followed Alaric through years of conflict, the idea of becoming allies with their former enemies may have appeared as a betrayal of their original goals. Could internal opposition have led to his assassination? Ancient sources suggest that Athaulf was killed by a member of his own household, possibly a warrior who had a personal grievance against him. Some accounts mention that the assassin may have been connected to an earlier enemy of the king. However, the exact identity and motive remain uncertain. Another possibility is that Athaulf's political direction created a broader conspiracy. By strengthening ties with Rome, Athaulf changed the balance of power among the Visigoths. Leaders who benefited from constant warfare and independence may have feared losing influence. A peaceful agreement with Rome could have threatened those who had built their status through conflict. There is also the question of Galla Placidia's role in his story. Their marriage represented a bridge between two cultures, but it also carried political risks. Some Roman officials viewed the relationship with suspicion, while some Visigoths may have believed that Athaulf had become too closely connected to the empire he once opposed. However, there is no clear evidence proving that Roman or Visigothic factions organized his death. The timing of Athaulf's assassination makes the mystery even more significant. His death occurred during a period when the Visigoths were attempting to establish themselves in Hispania and negotiate their place within the Roman political system. Removing the king at that moment could have changed the direction of their future. After Athaulf's death, his successor, Sigeric, ruled briefly before being replaced by Wallia. The Visigoths eventually established a powerful kingdom in southwestern Gaul and Hispania, becoming one of the successor states that emerged from the transformation of the Western Roman world. Yet the path they followed might have been different if Athaulf had lived longer. Would he have created a lasting alliance between the Visigoths and Rome? Could his vision of cooperation have changed the course of European history? Or was his approach impossible in a world where old enemies struggled to trust one another? The death of Athaulf remains a mystery because the evidence offers only fragments. A king attempting to unite two worlds disappeared suddenly, leaving behind questions about loyalty, ambition, and the fragile nature of power. Somewhere within the lost records of the 5th century, the true motive behind his assassination may still exist. Was Athaulf killed by personal revenge, political resistance, or a hidden struggle over the future of the Visigoths themselves? The answer remains concealed among the uncertain shadows of an empire entering its final transformation. The vast plains surrounding the Roman frontier were once crossed by armies moving between two worlds. To the east stood Constantinople, the wealthy heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, protected by enormous walls and filled with imperial treasures. To the west lay Gaul, a region of fertile lands, competing kingdoms, and shifting alliances. In AD 451, when the armies of the Huns began their great campaign, many expected them to strike directly at Constantinople. Instead, they turned west. The decision remains one of the most debated choices in the career of Attila the Hun. His empire stretched across vast territories, and his armies had already forced the Eastern Roman Empire to pay tribute and negotiate from a position of weakness. Yet, rather than continuing pressure against Constantinople, Attila launched one of his most ambitious campaigns into Gaul. Why choose a difficult Western invasion when the riches of the Eastern Empire seemed closer? The answer reveals the complicated nature of Attila's ambitions and the uncertain politics of the 5th century. By the middle of the 5th century, Attila had become one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. The Hunnic Empire was not a traditional state with fixed borders and a centralized government like Rome. Instead, it was a network of tribes, allies, and conquered peoples held together by military success and the authority of its ruler. For Attila, expansion was not only about territory, it was about maintaining loyalty. A ruler of the steppe depended on victories, wealth, and the ability to reward followers. Without new achievements, alliances could weaken. The expectations of warriors and allied groups created constant pressure for further campaigns. The Eastern Roman Empire had already experienced this pressure. During the reign of Emperor Theodosius II, Constantinople had negotiated with Attila and paid large sums of money to avoid conflict. At first glance, this relationship might suggest that Attila had every reason to continue threatening the East. The empire was wealthy, and its capital contained enormous resources. But Constantinople was not an easy target. The city was protected by massive defensive walls, a powerful military structure, and the ability to resist long sieges. Attila may have recognized that capturing Constantinople would require enormous resources and involve significant risks. Gaul presented a different opportunity. The region was politically divided and contained several competing powers. The Western Roman Empire still claimed authority there, but its control was weakening. Local groups, Roman commanders, and Germanic kingdoms all competed for influence. A successful campaign in Gaul could provide Attila with new territory, wealth, and political leverage. However, the exact reason for the invasion remains uncertain. One traditional explanation connects the campaign to a dispute involving Honoria, the sister of Emperor Valentinian III. According to later accounts, Honoria sent a message to Attila and offered him a ring, which he interpreted as a marriage proposal. Attila then claimed that he had a right to marry her and demanded part of the Western Empire as a dowry. Whether this story reflects reality or later political storytelling is debated. Some historians believe the episode may have been exaggerated, while others think it could have provided Attila with a useful justification for intervention. Another possibility is that Attila saw Gaul as a way to weaken the Western Roman Empire directly. The West was already struggling with internal divisions, and its military defenses were stretched. By attacking Gaul, Attila could pressure Roman authorities while demonstrating his power to allies and rivals throughout Europe. Yet there was another factor: the presence of the Visigoths. The Visigoths had become a significant power in Gaul, and their relationship with Rome was complicated. They were sometimes allies and sometimes opponents of the empire. Attila may have viewed them as a dangerous rival whose influence needed to be challenged. A campaign against Gaul would allow him to confront both Roman and Visigothic forces at once. The result was the famous confrontation at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in AD 451. The battle was one of the largest conflicts of the late Roman period, bringing together Attila's forces against an alliance led by the Roman general Aetius and the Visigoth king Theodoric I. The outcome was unclear. Neither side achieved a complete victory, but Attila withdrew from Gaul. This raises another mystery. If Gaul was so important, why did Attila leave? Some historians suggest that the campaign had achieved its purpose. Attila had demonstrated his strength, weakened his opponents, and shown that no region was beyond his reach. Others believe military losses, supply difficulties, and the unexpected strength of the Roman-Visigoth alliance forced him to reconsider. There are also theories that political calculations influenced his decision. A prolonged war in Gaul may have united his enemies against him, creating a situation where continued fighting became more dangerous than retreat. The choice to invade Gaul rather than Constantinople reveals that Attila was not simply seeking destruction. He was a ruler, balancing military opportunities, political messages, and the survival of his empire. Yet, the mystery remains. Was Gaul chosen because it offered easier conquest than the heavily defended East? Was the campaign driven by personal ambitions connected to Honoria, or was it part of a larger strategy to dominate the Roman world? Did Attila abandon Constantinople because he feared its defenses, or because his true ambitions lay somewhere else? The surviving records provide clues, but they do not reveal every calculation behind the decision. Somewhere between diplomacy, warfare, and the ambitions of one of history's most powerful conquerors lies the hidden reason why Attila turned west toward Gaul and away from the walls of Constantinople. As the Roman presence in Britain faded and new powers began emerging across the island, a different story was taking shape along the eastern shores. Across the windswept coastlines facing the North Sea, small settlements grew where Roman forts once stood, and new groups arrived carrying different languages, traditions, and ambitions. Among the names preserved from this uncertain age are two figures who became symbols of a new era in British history. They were Hengist and Horsa. According to medieval tradition, these two brothers were warriors from across the sea who arrived in Britain during the 5th century and helped establish the first Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Their story appears at the beginning of the transformation that changed Britain after Roman rule, but behind the familiar legend lies a deeper mystery. Who were Hengist and Horsa really? Were they historical leaders whose achievements were later expanded through storytelling, or were they symbolic figures created to represent a much larger movement of migration and political change? The earliest surviving accounts of their story come centuries after the events they describe. The 8th century historian Bede wrote that Britain's leaders invited Germanic warriors to help defend the island against northern enemies after the Roman withdrawal. According to this tradition, Hengist and Horsa arrived as mercenaries and later turned against their hosts, beginning a new chapter in British history. However, the historical evidence is far less certain. The 5th century was a period of enormous change across Europe. The Western Roman Empire was weakening, and communities throughout former Roman territories were adapting to a new political reality. Britain was no exception. When Roman administration disappeared, local rulers had to organize their own defenses and alliances. In this unstable environment, groups from regions near modern-day northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands began settling in parts of eastern Britain. Archaeological discoveries reveal changes in material culture, burial practices, and settlement patterns that suggest significant migration. But did two specific warriors named Hengist and Horsa lead this movement? The names themselves create another layer of mystery. In Old English tradition, Hengist means stallion, and Horsa means horse. Because both names are connected to horses, some historians have suggested that they may have symbolic origins. Horse imagery held great importance among many Germanic peoples, often associated with power, ancestry, and warrior identity. Could Hengist and Horsa have originally represented legendary ancestors rather than historical individuals? this possibility does not necessarily mean the figures were completely fictional. Ancient societies often preserved memories of real leaders through stories that changed over generations. A successful warrior or founding family could become transformed into a larger-than-life figure, carrying the hopes and identity of later communities. Some researchers have searched for possible historical foundations behind the legend. One theory suggests that Hengist may have been a real military leader who served as a mercenary commander during Britain's unstable transition after Rome. In this interpretation, the story reflects a common pattern of the period. Foreign soldiers were invited to help defend a region, then used their military influence to establish their own authority. Another possibility is that Hengist and Horsa represent a combination of several different leaders. As generations passed, memories of early settlers may have merged into a single origin story that explained how Anglo-Saxon communities came to Britain. The role of the Britons in this story is also debated. Medieval accounts describe a British ruler, often named Vortigern, inviting Hengist and Horsa to Britain. However, Vortigern's own historical existence remains uncertain. He may represent a real leader from the period, or his name may have become attached to stories about the collapse of Roman Britain. If such an invitation occurred, it would not have been unusual. Roman Britain had long relied on foreign soldiers, and local rulers continued similar practices after imperial authority disappeared. The decision may have been a practical attempt to solve a military problem rather than an act of betrayal. Yet the consequences were significant. According to tradition, conflicts eventually developed between the newcomers and the native Britons. The arrival of Anglo-Saxon groups contributed to the formation of new kingdoms such as Kent, Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex. Over time, these kingdoms shaped the language, culture, and identity of medieval England. But the exact beginning remains hidden. The archaeological record shows migration and cultural change, but it does not reveal personal stories. It cannot confirm whether two brothers named Hengist and Horsa stood on the shores of Britain Censure. Centuries ago, leading their followers into a new homeland. The mystery continues because their story exists between history and legend. They may have been real warriors whose lives were transformed by centuries of storytelling. They may have been symbolic figures created to explain the origins of a new society. Or they may represent something in between, a memory of real events preserved through a changing world. The winds that once carried ships across the North Sea have long since fallen silent, and the voices of those who lived through this transformation are gone. Yet the names Hengist and Horsa remain, leaving behind one final question. Were they the founders of a new Britain, or are they echoes of a deeper story that history has only partially revealed? The road south through Italy was filled with uncertainty as the Visigoth army moved away from Rome. Behind them was a city shaken by the first foreign occupation in centuries, and ahead lay an unknown future for a people searching for a permanent home. Among those traveling with the Visigoths was a woman whose fate connected two worlds that seemed impossible to unite. She was Galla Placidia, daughter of the Roman Emperor Theodosius I, sister of Emperor Honorius, and one of the most influential women of the late Roman Empire. Yet, in a D410, she was not a ruler. She was a prisoner. When the Visigoths entered Rome under the leadership of Alaric I, they captured Galla Placidia among the city's most valuable hostages. Her presence gave Alaric something far more important than wealth. She represented a direct connection to the imperial family, a living symbol of Roman legitimacy. But what happened next remains one of the most fascinating political mysteries of the 5th century. Why did the Visigoths eventually release her? At first, keeping Galla Placidia seemed like the perfect advantage. She was not simply a noblewoman. Her bloodline connected her to the highest levels of Roman authority. Any negotiation involving her could influence the decisions of emperors, generals, and senators. For the Visigoths, she was a powerful bargaining tool. After the sack of Rome, Alaric continued moving through Italy, attempting to secure a settlement for his people. His goal was not merely destruction. He wanted land, recognition, and a stable future for the Visigoths within the changing Roman world. Galla Placidia's captivity may have strengthened his position during these negotiations. However, Alaric died suddenly in AD 410, and the direction of Visigoth policy changed under his successor, Athaulf. Instead of continuing a purely confrontational approach, Athaulf sought a closer relationship with Rome. This shift may explain why Galla Placidia's role became even more significant. According to ancient sources, Athaulf and Galla Placidia eventually married in AD 414. Their marriage was unusual and politically meaningful. A Roman imperial princess and a Visigothic king were now connected by family ties, creating the possibility of cooperation between two groups that had spent years fighting each other. But was their relationship only political? The surviving accounts suggest that Athaulf admired Roman culture and wanted to create a new order that combined Roman traditions with Visigothic power. Galla Placidia may have represented a bridge between these two worlds. Yet, this alliance was fragile. Many Romans viewed the marriage with suspicion. To some, Galla Placidia's connection to a foreign king represented humiliation after the sack of Rome. To others, it may have offered a practical solution during a time when the empire was struggling to survive. The political importance of Galla Placidia also meant that her fate could never be separated from wider conflicts. After Athaulf's assassination in AD 415, Galla Placidia's situation changed again. She was returned to Roman control and later married Constantius III, a powerful Roman general who became emperor for a brief period. She eventually became one of the most influential figures in the Western Roman Empire, acting as regent for her young son Valentinian III. But the mystery remains. Why did the Visigoths give up such a valuable person? One explanation is that the marriage alliance fulfilled Athaulf's political goals. By connecting himself to the imperial family, he gained prestige and legitimacy. Once this relationship ended with his death, Galla Placidia may have lost much of her value to Visigoth leaders. Another possibility is that the Visigoths recognized the risks of holding her. Keeping an imperial hostage could have prevented any lasting agreement with Rome and encouraged further conflict. Releasing her may have been a strategic choice rather than an act of weakness. There are also questions about whether Galla Placidia herself influenced the decision. She was not merely a passive figure caught between powerful men. Her intelligence, education, and imperial background allowed her to navigate a dangerous political landscape. Her later career suggests that she understood how to use diplomacy and family connections to survive. Still, the exact motivations behind her release remain uncertain. Was she freed because the Visigoths no longer needed her? Was her marriage to Athaulf part of a larger attempt to reshape the Roman world? Or did her return to Rome represent a carefully planned political exchange whose details have been lost? The journey of Galla Placidia from imperial prisoner to one of Rome's most powerful women reveals the complexity of an age where enemies could become allies and captivity could become a path to influence. Her story stands at the intersection of Roman decline and the rise of new kingdoms. Yet, behind the surviving records lies a question that history cannot fully answer. When the Visigoths released Galla Placidia, were they surrendering a hostage, or returning a woman who had already changed the future of both Rome and the people who captured her? The fate of Galla Placidia after her captivity reveals a larger truth about the final centuries of the Roman Empire. Power was no longer controlled only through armies and conquest. It was also shaped through marriages, family connections, and the ability of individuals to move between different worlds. Her life became a symbol of an era where the boundaries between Roman and barbarian were beginning to disappear. The Visigoths who captured her had once been viewed by Rome as a threat from beyond the imperial borders. Yet, within only a few years, one of their most important leaders was connected by marriage to the very dynasty they had challenged. This transformation shows how quickly political realities could change in a collapsing empire. But Galla Placidia's story also raises another question. Was she simply a valuable piece in the struggles between kings and emperors, or did she become a political force in her own right? The answer is more complicated than the traditional image of a captured princess waiting for events to decide her fate. From the moment she entered Visigothic custody, Galla Placidia represented something unique. She carried the authority of Rome's imperial family, but she was surrounded by a people who were building their own identity and seeking recognition within the Roman world. Her presence created possibilities. For the Visigoths, she offered a connection to the ancient legitimacy of Rome. For Roman leaders, her return meant recovering a member of the imperial household whose bloodline carried enormous symbolic importance. In this sense, Galla Placidia was not merely a prisoner. She was a living link between two civilizations moving toward an uncertain future. The marriage between Athaulf and Galla Placidia remains one of the most fascinating examples of political transformation during this period. Ancient writers described Athaulf as a ruler who gradually changed his ambitions. According to some accounts, he once dreamed of replacing Roman power with Visigothic dominance, but later believed that cooperation with Rome offered a more realistic path. Whether these accounts accurately describe his personal thoughts is impossible to know, but the marriage itself clearly carried political meaning. A union between a Roman imperial princess and a Visigothic king suggested that the future might not belong entirely to one side. Instead of a simple conflict between Romans and outsiders, a new world was emerging where different traditions could combine. However, such alliances were always fragile. The death of Athaulf ended this experiment, and Galla Placidia once again became a figure caught between competing powers. Her return to Roman society did not mark the end of her influence. Instead, it began another chapter in which she would shape imperial politics from within. As the mother of Valentinian III, she became one of the most powerful people in the Western Roman Empire. During her regency, she influenced military appointments, diplomatic decisions, and the direction of imperial policy. The former hostage of the Visigoths had become one of Rome's central political figures. This remarkable transformation makes her story even more mysterious. How did a woman taken as a prisoner during the sack of Rome rise to become a ruler behind the throne? Was her survival the result of extraordinary intelligence, careful diplomacy, or simply the unusual circumstances of an empire in crisis? Perhaps it was all of these things combined. Galla Placidia lived during a period when traditional ideas of power were being rewritten. The old Roman system was weakening, but new forms of leadership were appearing. Influence could come not only from military victories, but from family ties, negotiation, and the ability to understand a changing world. Her journey also reveals the complexity of the Visigoths themselves. They were not simply destroyers of Rome. Like many groups that entered Roman territory, they sought security, land, and a place within the political order of the empire. Their relationship with Galla Placidia demonstrates that conflict and cooperation often existed at the same time. The same people who captured her later became connected to her through marriage and diplomacy. The same empire that considered them a threat later negotiated with them as political partners. This uncertain balance would define much of the 5th century. Yet, many details remain hidden. The exact conversations between Galla Placidia and Athaulf are lost. The true reasons behind her release are unknown. The private calculations of Roman and Visigothic leaders disappeared with the people who made them. Only fragments remain. The marble halls of the imperial court in Ravenna were filled with whispers, accusations, and political calculations. In the final decades of the Western Roman Empire, power was no longer secured only through armies and victories. It depended on alliances, reputation, and the ability to survive within a world where a single accusation could destroy even the most respected figures. Among the most powerful men caught in this dangerous environment was Bonifacius, a military commander whose career would become connected to one of the most mysterious political betrayals of late Roman history. At the center of the mystery is a question that has remained unanswered for centuries. Who convinced the imperial court that Bonifacius had become an enemy of Rome? The events unfolded during a period of intense rivalry inside the Western Roman government. The empire was struggling with external threats, economic difficulties, and conflicts among its own leaders. In this unstable atmosphere, political information could be as powerful as any army. Bonifacius had earned a reputation as one of Rome's most capable commanders. He controlled the province of Africa, a region of enormous importance because of its wealth, agricultural production, and strategic position in the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled Africa held influence over one of the empire's most valuable territories. But his success also made him a potential threat. At the imperial court, powerful figures competed for influence over the young emperor Valentinian III and his government. Among them was Flavius Aetius, another ambitious military leader whose career would later become closely connected with Bonifacius. According to the 6th century historian Procopius of Caesarea, Bonifacius was warned by the court that he had been accused of planning rebellion. The accusation allegedly convinced him that the imperial government intended to remove him, leading him to refuse orders and prepare for conflict. But who delivered the accusation? The identity of the person responsible remains one of the great unanswered questions. One traditional explanation points toward political rivals at court who wanted to weaken Bonifacius. A successful general controlling Africa could become too independent, and removing him from influence would benefit those seeking greater control over imperial decisions. Another possibility involves the rivalry between Bonifacius and Aetius. Both men were among the strongest military figures in the Western Empire. Their competition reflected a larger struggle over who would become the dominant power behind the throne. Some interpretations suggest that enemies of Bonifacius may have used this rivalry to create distrust between him and the imperial government. However, the evidence does not provide a clear culprit. A name that frequently appears in discussions of this period is Galla Placidia, the mother and regent of Valentinian III. As the most influential figure at court during the emperor's youth, she played a major role in political decisions. Some later interpretations suggest that court factions surrounding her may have contributed to the conflict with Bonifacius. Yet, there is no direct proof that she ordered or supported any false accusation. The political world of the 5th century was filled with competing interests, and many figures had reasons to manipulate information. The person who spread the accusation may not have acted alone. It could have been part of a wider campaign involving several officials seeking to reshape the balance of power. The consequences were dramatic. Believing that the imperial court had turned against him, Bonifacius strengthened his position in Africa and eventually became involved in a conflict with Roman forces. The resulting instability opened the door for one of the most significant events in late Roman history: the arrival of the Vandals in North Africa. Some accounts claim that Bonifacius later invited the Vandals into Africa as allies during his struggle against the imperial government. Whether this invitation occurred exactly as described remains debated, but the political crisis created by the accusation certainly contributed to the weakening of Roman control. The mystery of the betrayal therefore extends far beyond one individual. It became a turning point that affected the fate of an entire region. Was Bonifacius truly betrayed by a jealous rival seeking power? Was the accusation part of a larger imperial struggle? Or was it the result of misunderstandings and political fear during a period when trust within the Roman government was rapidly disappearing? The surviving sources preserve the consequences, but not the complete story. Somewhere within the lost conversations of the imperial court, the identity of the person who turned Bonifacius against Rome may still remain hidden. The accusation changed the course of history, but the voice behind it, the person who first whispered suspicion into the halls of power, has disappeared into the shadows of the past. The story of Bonifacius reveals how fragile the foundations of power had become in the final centuries of the Western Roman Empire. A single accusation, perhaps spoken in a private conversation, or delivered through a carefully crafted message, was enough to change the fate of armies, provinces, and entire civilizations. But the mystery surrounding Bonifacius does not end with the question of who betrayed him. It continues with what happened after trust between the commander and the imperial court was broken. Once a loyal servant of Rome, Bonifacius found himself caught between two impossible choices. He could submit to a government he believed was preparing to destroy him, or he could defend himself and risk being labeled a traitor. In a world where political survival depended on perception, even an act of self-defense could become evidence of rebellion. This was the dangerous reality of late Roman politics. The empire was still vast, but its unity was weakening. Provinces that had once followed orders from distant emperors were becoming increasingly dependent on local commanders. Men like Bonifacius were no longer simply generals carrying out imperial commands. They were powerful figures with their own armies, resources, and influence. Africa was especially important in this struggle. The region was one of the richest territories under Roman control. Its agricultural wealth helped supply Rome with essential resources, and its location made it a key point for controlling Mediterranean trade routes. Losing influence over Africa meant losing more than a province. It meant losing a vital part of the empire's strength. This importance may explain why Bonifacius became the center of suspicion. A commander with control over Africa could be viewed as a protector of Rome, but also as a potential rival. The same qualities that made him valuable to the empire also made him dangerous to those who feared independent military power. This pattern would appear repeatedly during Rome's final decades. Generals who defended the empire sometimes became threats in the eyes of political leaders. Emperors who relied on military commanders often feared the very men who protected their authority. Trust became increasingly difficult to maintain because every alliance carried the possibility of betrayal. For Bonifacius, the consequences were irreversible. The conflict between him and the imperial government created an opening that would transform the history of North Africa. The arrival of the Vandals changed the balance of power in the Western Mediterranean, and eventually led to the creation of a powerful kingdom on former Roman territory. Whether Bonifacius truly invited them remains one of the most debated questions of the period. Some historians believe the situation was more complicated than later sources suggest. He may have sought temporary military support rather than intentionally opening the gates to a foreign conquest. Others argue that desperation and political isolation forced him into decisions that produced consequences he never intended. The truth may lie somewhere between these possibilities. History often remembers the major events: the arrival of the Vandals, the loss of Roman Africa, and the transformation of the Mediterranean world. But behind these events were personal struggles between individuals trying to survive within a collapsing system. The person who accused Bonifacius may have believed they were protecting the empire. They may have been seeking personal advantage. They may have simply been repeating information that was already circulating within a frightened and divided court. Whatever the motive, the result was the same. A relationship between one of Rome's greatest commanders and the imperial government was destroyed, and from that broken relationship emerged consequences that would last for generations. The mystery remains because ancient sources rarely reveal private intentions. They tell us what happened after decisions were made, but they often hide the conversations that shaped those decisions. Somewhere within the forgotten chambers of the imperial court, there may have been a moment when the fate of Rome's African provinces was altered by a single message, a single accusation, or a single act of political manipulation. And as the Western Empire continued its slow transformation, more figures would face similar choices, whether to remain loyal to a fading power, challenge a weakening system, or seek survival in a world where old alliances were beginning to disappear. The halls of the imperial palace in Rome were no longer filled with the confidence of earlier centuries. The city still carried the memory of emperors who had commanded vast armies and ruled territories stretching across continents. But by the middle of the 5th century, the imperial throne had become a place of danger rather than glory. Every decision carried enormous risk, and every ruler faced enemies within and beyond the borders of the empire. It was into this uncertain world that Petronius Maximus stepped forward. His reign lasted only a few months, yet his decision to claim the imperial title after the assassination of Valentinian III remains one of the most puzzling moments in the final decades of the Western Roman Empire. Why would a powerful Roman aristocrat choose to become emperor at a time when the empire was surrounded by crisis? The answer may reveal how ambition, fear, and political opportunity collided during Rome's final years in the West. Before becoming emperor, Petronius Maximus was not an outsider seeking power. He was a highly respected senator from one of Rome's wealthiest families. He had held important government positions and possessed significant influence within the imperial system. He understood the weaknesses of the empire better than most. By AD 455, the Western Roman Empire was facing enormous challenges. Military authority was divided among competing generals, imperial control over distant provinces had weakened, and foreign kingdoms had gained power within former Roman territories. Yet, the imperial throne still carried unmatched symbolic importance. When Valentinian III was assassinated in March AD 455, the empire suddenly entered another succession crisis. The young emperor's death removed a ruler who had occupied the throne for decades, leaving behind a dangerous political vacuum. Within this uncertainty, Petronius Maximus moved quickly. Ancient sources suggest that he pressured the imperial court and secured recognition as the new emperor, but the exact circumstances remain unclear. Did he genuinely believe he could restore stability? Did he see an opportunity created by Valentinian's death? Or was he simply trying to prevent another faction from gaining control? The motives behind his decision are still debated. One interpretation suggests that Petronius Maximus believed his experience and wealth made him the best candidate to save the empire. Unlike military commanders who often gained power through force, he represented the traditional Roman aristocracy. Perhaps he believed that political authority, administration, and diplomacy could repair the damage caused by years of instability. However, the reality of imperial power had changed. The emperor of the 5th century no longer commanded the same authority as earlier rulers. Military leaders had become increasingly important, and many emperors depended on powerful generals to maintain control. Petronius Maximus lacked the military reputation needed to inspire confidence among soldiers. Another possibility is that his rise was motivated by personal revenge. Some ancient accounts connect him with Valentinian III's assassination, suggesting that he may have had reasons to resent the former emperor. According to later traditions, Petronius Maximus had suffered a personal humiliation involving Valentinian and his family, although these stories are difficult to verify. If true, his decision to take the throne may have been influenced not only by political ambition, but also by a desire to replace a ruler he considered responsible for his misfortune. Yet, becoming emperor brought immediate dangers. The Western Empire was already struggling, and Petronius inherited problems that could not be solved quickly. The Vandal king Gaiseric controlled North Africa and possessed a powerful fleet. Relations between Rome and the Vandals were already tense, especially after the death of Valentinian III disrupted previous agreements. Petronius Maximus attempted to strengthen his position by arranging a new marriage alliance within the imperial family, but this decision may have created further instability. His actions were interpreted by some as a rejection of previous agreements, contributing to Gaiseric's decision to move against Rome. Was Petronius Maximus simply unlucky, or did his own choices accelerate the disaster approaching the empire? His short reign ended when the Vandals arrived in Italy in AD 455. Facing the threat of invasion and growing panic within Rome, Petronius attempted to flee the city but was killed by an angry crowd. His time as emperor had lasted only around 2 months. Yet the mystery surrounding his rise remains. Why did a man with wealth, status, and political experience choose to accept a position that had become almost impossible to defend? Did he believe he could restore Roman authority, or did he underestimate how fragile the empire had become? Perhaps Petronius Maximus saw the imperial throne differently from those who came before him. It was no longer the unquestioned center of the ancient world, but a final symbol of legitimacy in a collapsing political order. The surviving records reveal his actions, but they cannot fully reveal his thoughts. Somewhere between ambition, fear, and a desperate attempt to control events lies the true reason why Petronius Maximus reached for the imperial crown when Rome's future was already slipping away. The downfall of Petronius Maximus was not only the story of one failed emperor. It was another sign of a much deeper transformation taking place across the Roman world. The events that surrounded his brief reign revealed a reality that many within the empire struggled to accept. The institutions that had once protected Rome were no longer strong enough to guarantee stability. The imperial title still carried the weight of centuries. The name of the emperor still appeared on official documents, coins, and monuments. Yet, behind the symbols of power, the foundations were becoming increasingly fragile. For those who lived through this period, the question was not simply who would wear the imperial crown. The greater question was whether the crown itself still held the power it once represented. After the death of Petronius Maximus, Rome faced another humiliation that would echo through history. The arrival of the Vandals under Gaiseric exposed how vulnerable the city had become. A capital that had once commanded the Mediterranean now found itself unable to prevent foreign armies from reaching its gates. But the story of Rome's decline was not only about invasions, it was also about the struggle between old traditions and a rapidly changing world. The aristocratic families of Rome continued to hold wealth, influence, and social prestige. Men like Petronius Maximus represented a political class that had survived for generations through diplomacy, administration, and connections within the imperial court. Yet, the world around them was changing faster than their methods could adapt. Military commanders increasingly became the true power behind emperors. Armies decided political outcomes, and generals could determine who sat upon the throne. The traditional Senate class still possessed authority, but its ability to control events was gradually disappearing. This raises another question about Petronius Maximus. Was he a man trapped by the expectations of his own time? Perhaps he believed that restoring the dignity of the imperial office could restore the empire itself. Perhaps he saw himself as a protector of Roman traditions during a moment when those traditions were being threatened from every direction. Or perhaps he simply misunderstood the nature of power in the 5th century. The emperor was no longer the unquestioned master of the Roman world. The title had become something far more dangerous, a position that attracted enemies, exposed weaknesses, and offered little protection to those who held it. Other rulers would face the same impossible challenge. Some would attempt to rely on diplomacy. Others would depend on military strength. Some would seek alliances with groups once considered enemies of Rome. But few could escape the larger forces reshaping the Western Empire. The collapse of imperial authority was not caused by a single decision or a single invasion. It was the result of decades of political struggles, economic pressures, military challenges, and changing relationships between Rome and the peoples surrounding it. Petronius Maximus became one of the final figures caught in this storm. His story also reveals something about the nature of ambition. Throughout history, powerful individuals have often reached for positions at the moment when those positions become the most dangerous. The imperial throne of Rome still represented greatness, but behind the image of glory was a reality of uncertainty and constant threat. For a man like Petronius Maximus, becoming emperor may have appeared to be the highest achievement possible. Yet, within weeks, the same position that promised authority became a path toward destruction. The mystery is not only why he accepted the throne, but why the throne remained so desirable even when its dangers were obvious. What did people like Petronius Maximus see when they looked at the imperial crown? Did they see the last chance to restore Rome's former greatness, or did they see a final opportunity to preserve their own influence before the old order disappeared? The answer may never be fully known, but his brief reign remains a reminder of a world standing between two eras. One belonged to the ancient empire that had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries. The other belonged to the kingdoms and societies that would rise from its remains. And as Rome moved closer toward its final transformation, more mysteries would emerge from the shadows. Stories of forgotten rulers, hidden alliances, and decisions that changed the course of history forever. The winds that crossed the shores of Britain carried away more than the sounds of marching soldiers. They carried the ambitions of men who attempted to challenge an empire already struggling to hold itself together. Among those who dared to oppose the authority of the Western Roman government was a man who briefly claimed the imperial title and gathered supporters around his cause. His name was Constantine III. For a short period in the early 5th century, Constantine III controlled much of Britain and parts of Gaul, presenting himself as a rival emperor during one of the most unstable moments in Roman history. His rise was sudden, his campaign was ambitious, and his fall was inevitable. But while Constantine's fate is recorded in fragments, the destiny of the people who supported him remains far more uncertain. Who were the soldiers, officials, and communities that followed his banner after his defeat? What happened to those who had committed themselves to a failed emperor? The answers disappear into one of the darker corners of late Roman history. To understand the mystery, it is necessary to look back at the crisis that created Constantine III's rebellion. In AD 406, the Western Roman Empire faced a major breakdown along its northern frontiers. Groups such as the Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed into Gaul, overwhelming Roman defenses and creating chaos across the region. At the same time, Britain was experiencing growing uncertainty. The island's military forces were expected to defend a distant province while the empire struggled with threats on multiple fronts. During this period, Roman soldiers in Britain elevated Constantine to imperial status. The reasons behind this choice remain debated. One possibility is that the troops believed the central government had abandoned them. By creating their own emperor, they may have been attempting to protect their interests and restore stability. Another interpretation suggests that military leaders in Britain saw an opportunity to gain greater influence during a period when the traditional imperial system was weakening. Whatever the motivation, Constantine moved quickly. He crossed into Gaul and established control over important regions. For a time, he was recognized as a serious political rival to the emperor in Italy. His administration attempted to function like a legitimate Roman government, complete with officials, military commands, and diplomatic efforts. His supporters were not simply rebels on the edge of the empire. Many were members of the Roman military and administration who believed they were serving a legitimate emperor, but their position became increasingly fragile. Constantine III faced opposition from Honorius, the recognized emperor of the Western Roman Empire. The imperial government could not allow a rival ruler to remain in control of valuable territories. The conflict eventually turned against Constantine. His general Gerontius later rebelled against him, weakening his position further. Internal divisions, military defeats, and pressure from loyalist Roman forces caused his authority to collapse. By AD 411, Constantine III was defeated and captured. Ancient sources suggest that he was forced to surrender and was later executed. But what happened to everyone who had supported him? The historical record becomes almost silent. Some of Constantine's closest followers likely faced punishment. In Roman political culture, supporting a failed emperor could be considered treason. Officials who had served under him may have lost their positions, their property, or even their lives. Yet, the scale of the punishment remains unclear. Unlike earlier civil wars where victorious emperors sometimes carried out widespread purges, the 5th century empire often lacked the resources and stability needed for complete retaliation. The government needed experienced administrators and soldiers, even among those who had previously supported rivals. Could some of Constantine's followers have been forgiven and absorbed back into Roman society? This possibility is supported by the practical realities of the period. The Western Roman Empire was under enormous pressure. It faced invasions, economic problems, and a shortage of reliable military forces. Eliminating every person connected to Constantine's regime may have weakened the empire further. Some soldiers who fought for him may have simply changed allegiance and continued serving under new commanders. Others may have disappeared into the changing political landscape of Gaul. Did they become part of the military forces that served later Roman or Germanic rulers? The evidence provides few answers. Archaeology offers some clues about the period, revealing changes in settlements, military activity, and trade, but it rarely identifies individuals or explains personal journeys. The lives of ordinary soldiers and administrators are often lost behind the names of emperors and generals. Even Constantine's own rebellion remains difficult to fully understand. Was he truly attempting to save Roman Britain and Gaul during a crisis, or was he simply another ambitious commander seeking power? Were his supporters loyal followers of a legitimate ruler, or were they soldiers caught in circumstances beyond their control? These questions matter because Constantine III's story reflects a larger transformation taking place across the Roman world. The empire was no longer a system where authority flowed easily from the center outward. Provinces could create their own rulers. Armies could decide political futures. Communities could find themselves supporting one emperor today and another tomorrow. For the people who followed Constantine, the fall of their emperor was not just a political defeat. It was the collapse of the future they had chosen. Some may have been punished. Some may have been forgiven. Some may have vanished into the changing societies that emerged from the remains of Roman power. But their final chapters remain unwritten. The silence surrounding Constantine III's supporters leaves behind a question that history cannot fully answer. When a forgotten emperor fell, did his followers disappear with him, Or did they quietly become part of the new world that rose from the empire's decline? The uncertainty surrounding Constantine III's followers was not an isolated mystery. Across the final centuries of Roman power in the West, countless soldiers, officials, and families found themselves trapped between a fading empire and a world that was beginning to take a different shape. The fall of one emperor did not end the struggles of those who had served him. Instead, it forced them to choose new paths in an age where loyalty could become a burden and survival often required adaptation. The disappearance of Constantine's supporters reflects a much larger question about the transformation of the Roman world. When imperial authority weakened, what happened to the people who had built their lives around it? Did they continue defending Roman traditions, or did they gradually become part of the new kingdoms that emerged from the empire's remains? By the early 5th century, the boundaries between Roman and non-Roman society were becoming increasingly difficult to define. Many groups, once considered outsiders, had already become deeply connected to the Roman military system. Germanic soldiers served as generals, commanders, and elite warriors. Roman officials negotiated with local leaders rather than relying only on distant imperial authority. In this changing environment, the supporters of failed rulers were not always enemies of the state. Sometimes they were simply people caught inside political storms beyond their control. A soldier who had followed Constantine III may have believed he was protecting Roman Britain. An administrator in Gaul may have viewed Constantine's government as the only functioning authority available. Their choices were shaped by geography, fear, opportunity, and the need to survive. This was the reality of a collapsing political system. The Roman Empire had once provided a clear structure. A single emperor represented ultimate authority, and provinces were connected through laws, taxation, and military organization. But as central power weakened, those connections began to loosen. Local leaders gained influence. Regional armies became more independent. Former enemies became allies. Former allies became rivals. The people who lived through this transformation experienced a world where yesterday's loyalties could quickly become tomorrow's dangers. Perhaps some of Constantine III's followers found new positions under later Roman commanders. Others may have entered the service of emerging rulers in Gaul, where new political identities were forming. Some may have simply returned to ordinary lives, disappearing into villages and communities where imperial conflicts felt distant. History often remembers emperors because their names were preserved in official records. But the lives of ordinary supporters rarely received the same attention. Their stories were carried through families, settlements, and traditions rather than written documents. This creates another mystery. How many people connected to Constantine's rebellion continued influencing the future without leaving any visible trace? The answer may be hidden within the gradual transformation of Western Europe itself. The 5th century was not only an age of decline, it was also an age of creation. New kingdoms emerged, new alliances formed, and new cultures developed from the mixture of Roman and Germanic traditions. The people who survived the fall of old political structures became the foundations of the societies that followed. Perhaps some former supporters of Constantine III contributed to these changes without ever being recognized. A commander who once fought for a forgotten emperor may have later defended another ruler. A Roman official who served a defeated regime may have passed his knowledge of administration to a new generation. A soldier who abandoned a failed cause may have carried memories of Rome into a completely different world. The collapse of an empire was not a single event. It was a slow process experienced by millions of individuals whose names were never recorded. And this brings us back to the mystery surrounding Constantine III's supporters. Their fate remains unknown because history preserves moments of power more clearly than moments of survival. It records the rise of emperors, the movement of armies, and the outcome of battles. But it often leaves behind the quiet stories of those who adapted after the battles ended. Somewhere among the changing landscapes of Britain and Gaul, the descendants of these forgotten soldiers and officials may have continued living, carrying fragments of a world that had disappeared. The question remains, when Rome's authority faded and new kingdoms rose from its ruins, how many of those who once followed a failed emperor were not lost at all, but quietly became part of the future they never expected to create?